Now this week we are. Oh, I'm sorry. I was supposed to do the socially appropriate. How are you guys doing? How was your week? Blah blah blah.
It was amazing. It was great. And I'm
Excellent.
sorry, it's sad that we didn't get the turkey conversation on the recording,
Yeah, that is a shame. I think that'll
though.
have to incentivize. That'll work as an incentive for other people to show up early.
Yes.
Now, last Friday I did the star drawing, and for the 9-pointed star, I showed everybody how to do it in the traditional medieval way, but it is super complicated. And so we did a much easier way later on, which was really nice. And I sent out emails of with the playlists on YouTube to so you could, if anybody's interested, they could see how to draw those stars. And then Friday, I'm going to be boiling water and demonstrating how to make ink out of tea for everybody. We're using herbal tea, so that nobody gets offended. And but it actually gives a really interesting feel to what you do. I have a friend who's a calligrapher in Jordan, and he likes using inks that he makes himself. He likes using teas, and it's just he has a lot of fun doing it, and it gives it a really nice, warm presence to a piece when you use your own thing that you've made yourself for one thing, but the tea itself gives this really gentle warmth to whatever it is you do that I don't think you can get with very many other materials. Really interesting. Anyway, this week, we are going to be talking about Expressionism. Last week, we talked about Fauvism. One of the things that I have OCD, and one of the things that's really irritating to me is that artists working randomly around the world are not considered enough to really start and stop the styles of art that they do on a timer that everybody follows. Meaning that we could say that Impressionism started, say, in 1860 and wound up in 1889, and then it smoothly transitioned to Post-Impressionism. But that's just not true. I mean, Van Gogh did things that are classified as Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, and Expressionist as well, and he had the discourtesy to completely step over Fauvism, and that was not very considerate. And so when we look at this stuff, there are dates and years, and they're generally related to like a first showing that somebody put a label on something. But I think it's probably less frustrating just to think of them as part of a cognitive continuum of development, as artists were claiming permission to express themselves and discovering that there were random strangers that actually liked the stuff that they were doing. And I think that's kind of one of the messages of this week's this week's exploration.
Andrew,
Yeah.
question on that. I was thinking about that because when I was doing my research on Fauvism, I noticed a lot of different characteristics from some of the other, not time periods, but ways the artists were expressing themselves, like pointillism. I was looking like what I was researching. One of my favorite artists was the Andre Derain, who did Henri Matisse as well as the portrait of him, and as well as the Paul Signet. And I noticed that there was a lot of crossover with some of some of the styles that they were doing. And do you think that because Fauvism, from what we learned last week, it was a very small time period. Do you think that they knew they were extracting from different movements in order to fulfill their objectives in art?
They did extract from each other. They extracted from what they saw, and they extrapolated definitely. I don't know if how many artists active at the time were able to consistently give labels to each other. That seems to be more a product of us looking back than people living through. I think, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but there are some examples where people did specifically name the movement that they were doing, but that seems to be more an exception. Like, for example, Dada named itself, and they had fanzines, they communicated with each other, they did all sorts of stuff to kind of coordinate what aspects they were going to be each exploring, you know, what kind of media they were going to be exploring, and they would coordinate who was going to bring what when they did an exhibit. So there was a lot of really close-knit thought to that. And I think a big part of it is Marcel Duchamp and Hannah Hoch really understood how much power a visual artist can have, you know, in helping people to change their minds or help people to be self-reflective. But it seems like for a lot of the time, people were kind of just part of a community of like-minded artists moving forward. And like-minded not in, we're only going to be doing these subjects and those subjects and use these colors, but for example, color media was really starting to take off as people were developing cheap ways of mass producing printed, hand painted photographs, for example. And I wonder if seeing that all around, that kind of gave them the idea, hey, let's play with color for a bit. We know it can communicate. And so that led into Fauvism. And I don't think it was, I think it was more all the artists together kind of coming across that and thinking about let's do it, and less about calling each other up or telegraphing each other and saying, hey, we're going to do a show in 3 months' time. You want to, use blue. I don't think it was that. Like I said, there are movements that were like that were very tightly coordinated, and they had specific objectives. But I think a lot of the times it's artists. Wassily Kandinsky, in his book Spirituality and Art, which I heartily recommend to everybody, he was a super brilliant dude. One of the things he talks about is, and I think I may have referenced this earlier a couple weeks ago, he talks about how the artist has a responsibility of communicating beyond the restrictions of language and words. Part of that means that part of that is tied into the idea that they are, because of the way the brains work, at the forefront of cultural self-awareness. And they function not only as signalmen or signal women of the culture, to warn about what's going on, what's coming next, to guide self-reflection of the culture, but they also function as prophets as well. And I think this ties in. I think Van, was it you that was talking about how, or Joey, that Neil deGrasse Tyson said, when art reflects what we want to see, it's entertainment. When it reflects what we should be thinking about, then it's art.
Yeah, it was Joey. Joey said that one. That was great.
Yeah, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson was channeling Wassily Kandinsky a bit, because that really ties into what he was saying. That art can function and be perfectly fine as an entertainment vehicle. That is totally, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But it becomes something more, and artists have, I think, a responsibility to at least look and see if it's something that they feel called to do. But art also, I think, when it's best, provides a mirror of self-reflection for the culture within which the artist swims. And I see, from looking at the context that these artists lived in, they worked from many different countries, but it's all in this environment of that generation right before World War I, where tensions were building around the world and then finally came to a head. And this expressionism deals specifically with that numinous and negative stress, I think, all around the world. And that's what I see as a common denominator among all the people that spontaneously generated expressionist art. It seems to be kind of a visual explosion of the artist functioning as a self-reflector and prophet for society. So I think Wassily Kandinsky was really onto something. What do you guys think? Do you buy that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because when we're able to look back in retrospective, like you were saying, I think that we're able to see how there were certain movements within time periods. And it reminds me almost, since we work in the art department, just to kind of see, and the students and all of us kind of working together, a student sees a way that they're trimming their pots and they think, well, that is a great way. I'm going to try that as well. Or a person's painting a painting and they're using a certain color palette and they think, I'm going to try that as well. And so it almost is like a movement and progresses together as a group, or a group of individuals, but all moving towards the same objective of bettering their artwork. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, because it's not going to be, most of the time it's not 7 students looking at one person's palette and say, hey, talking to each other, let's coordinate and I'll do the same thing. It is very, very rarely that, but they're all in a learning community. They're all sharing something of the same headspace, like Dr. Rupert Sheldrake talks about. And I think that it's an indicator that they are moving parallel, as opposed to holding hands, writing notes to each other, and moving forward, as a unit kind of thing. But yeah, that's what I think anyway. It seems to make sense. Yeah, Brittany.
I agree with Van on, like when people are together and they bounce ideas or they see stuff and it spurs, and then we all move forward together. And I do buy into also the idea of when our world is in turmoil, we look for things, and it furthers our art. And so we can deal with what's going on around us that we have no control over.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating too, because you will have artists from around the world, from different countries, different areas, different backgrounds, doing things in their own unique way, that each, when a year or 2 years later, you look back and you realize they're all addressing the same kind of emotional issues, the same kind of stresses, or the same kind of cultural triggers, but they're all doing it in a very different way. And I think that I think that is a really good way of looking at it. Both of these things, people are. I told you about the ancient Yemenis architecture and the Yavapai architecture in northern Arizona, didn't I? In northern Arizona, where the Yavapai were, it's incredibly arid and dry. There's very little water, free-flowing water. And in southern Yemen, there's some areas that are almost identical with atmosphere, dryness, and heat, all that. What's interesting to me is about 1,000 years ago, the Yavapai started creating these stone structure homes that were about maybe 15, 20 feet high, and where a family dwelling would be built over a spring. And the particular architecture with these thick stone walls, the way that it was made created a natural air conditioning over this spring. And the reason that's interesting is 1,000 years before, in Yemen, in the same kind of landscape, people built houses that look almost identical, almost brick for brick, to what the Yavapai were doing 1,000 years later. And it's a testament more to, I think, what, like Van's talking about with the students and stuff like that. I think it's a testament to people sharing intelligence and drive, trying to get to the same place with the same kinds of materials at hand. And I think it's less indicative of the idea of alien overlords teaching everybody the same thing. which I'm not completely, but you know, and so yeah, I really appreciate what Brittany, what you and Van are both saying, because I think that really ties into what's actually going on. I think that's excellent. I wanted to show this image. This is Van Gogh, you know, tail end of Impressionism, and we can compare that with the stuff that he did as an Expressionist painter, and this is so much kinder and gentler than what he was doing later on. I mean, it's a beautiful scene of a farmhouse in France, and it looks gorgeous, and it is not very visually confrontational. It's very soothing, and I kind of like it because Van Gogh is remembered for doing stuff that is very different than this, but he did do this. This is how he started. And one of the things I talked about was just we've been talking about history, context, how the world changes, and the 4 tools of artistic critique. Do you guys remember what those 4 tools are? What the first one is?
Describe.
Excellent. And what's the second one? Do you remember, Van? Starts with an A.
Is it analyze?
Yes, yes. And the third one? This is where you apply meaning. The third one is interpret.
Okay, interpret. I'll have to look at my notes again.
And then the fourth one is evaluate. And those 4 tools I think are really important. However you examine the art, as long as you examine it with intent, it probably doesn't matter exactly what system you use, but I like those 4 steps. And as you go through and look at the work that we look at, I hope that you remember to examine it from that stance of critical thinking. And again, critical thinking has nothing to do with negativity. It has everything to do with method and intent. One of the things that I talk about in this is, and I think we mentioned last week, when words like post are added to a movement name, we generally think, well, that means that it happened right afterwards. And a lot of the times it does historically happen afterwards, but the post to something is more indicative of the intellectual relationship, where people are reacting or responding to things that they noticed in that other movement. And as an example of this, I use the pre-Raphaelites. You know, Raphael was a painter during the Renaissance, but the pre-Raphaelites were working in the 19th century. So, you know, several generations later. But they were addressing ideas that came to the fore through that other movement. And in this case, they were responding a little bit differently. They weren't necessarily reacting to the art movement as they were trying to do paintings that intellectually anticipated it, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. But there's, in this case, happily, artists talked about it themselves, which makes it a lot easier for us to understand what's going on. But there is this idea that I wanted to share, which is that as artists are moving away from easily identifiable reality, you know, a shared visual language, as they're moving away from that, they're moving sometimes at speed, sometimes a little bit slower, sometimes incredibly quickly. I think coupled with that, they're also claiming permission to share ever more personal ideas and thoughts and explorations. And I think it is completely appropriate that if artists are going to do that and claim the right to explore things that are unusual, we have the right to layer our own interpretation on their work too. And there's a video, I hope we can see this video. I know that the Doctor Who clip was cut out, so everybody had to watch it on their own, but I wanted to share this. I'm hoping that this will work. Let's see. And I'm trying to get past the YouTube ad before I share this with you. What I like about this is Alan is able to talk about what art is for. And I think it ties in to a lot of what we're discussing with this material.
You might think there was a simple answer to this. After all, we know how to say what most things are for, like this or that. And people flock to museums like never before, so they must have their motives. But when it comes to art, people get strangely afraid to ask too directly what it might all be for, because, well, everyone except you might know the answer already. It's perhaps too obvious, it's perhaps too complicated. The result is an awkward silence and a lot of confusion. But maybe it shouldn't be that hard to say what art is for. Maybe we can have a go at ascribing certain rather clear purposes to art. Here's 5 things that art might be able to do for us. It's an obvious but striking fact that the most popular works of art in the world show pretty things: happy people, flowers in spring, blue skies. This is the top-selling postcard in the world from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This enthusiasm for prettiness worries serious types a lot. They wonder, have people forgotten what life's really like? But that seems a misplaced worry. We need pretty things close to us, not because we're in danger of forgetting the bad stuff, but because terrible problems weigh so heavily on us that we're in danger of slipping into despair and depression. That's why prettiness matters. It's an emblem of hope, which is an achievement. Prettiness, those flowers and blue skies and kids in meadows, is hope bottled and preserved, waiting for us when we need it. The world often requires us to put on a cheerful facade, but beneath the surface there's a lot of sadness and regret that we can't express from fear of seeming weird or a loser. One thing art can do is reassure us of the normality of pain. It can be sad with and for us. Some of the world's greatest works of art have been loved for their capacity to make the pain that's inside all of us more publicly visible and available. Like putting on a sad piece of music, somber works of art don't have to depress us. Rather, they can give us the welcome feeling that pain is part of the human condition. Art fights the false optimism of commercial society. It's there to remind us with dignity that every good life has extraordinary amounts of confusion, suffering, loneliness, and distress within it, and that therefore we should never aggravate sadness by feeling we must be freakish simply for experiencing it quite a lot. All of us are a little unbalanced in some way. We're too intellectual or too emotional, too masculine or too feminine, too calm or too excitable. The art we love is frequently something we're drawn to because it compensates us for what we lack. It counterbalances us. When we're moved by a work of art, it may be because it contains concentrated doses of qualities we need more of in our lives. Perhaps it's full of the serenity we admire but don't have enough of. Perhaps it's got the tenderness we long for, but that our jobs and relationships are currently lacking. Or perhaps it's suffused with a pain and drama we've had to stifle but want to get in touch with. Sometimes a whole society falls in love with a certain style in art because it's trying to rebalance itself, like France in the late 18th century that wanted David as a corrective to its decadence, or Britain in the 19th century that looked to the pre-Raphaelites to counter the effects of brutal industrialization. The art a country or a person calls beautiful gives you vital clues as to what's missing in them. It's in the power of art to help us be more rounded, more balanced, and more sane. The media is constantly giving us hints about what's glamorous and important. Art also tells us about what's glamorous and important, but fortunately, given that you weren't invited again to the Oscars this year, it usually picks on some very different things. Albrecht Dürer makes grass look glamorous. John Constable draws our attention to the skies. Van Gogh reminds us that oranges are worth paying attention to. Marcel Duchamp challenges us to look again at the seemingly mundane. These artists aren't falsely glamorizing things that are better ignored. They're justly teasing out a value that's been neglected by a world with a deeply distorted and unfair sense of what truly matters. Art returns glamour to its rightful place, highlighting what's genuinely worth appreciating. Nothing seems further from good art than propaganda, the sort encouraging you to fight or what government to support. But one way to think about art is that it is a sort of propaganda, in the sense of a tool that motivates and energizes you for a cause, only it's propaganda on behalf of some of the most important and nicest emotions and attitudes in the world, which it uses its skills to make newly appealing and accessible. It might be propaganda about the simple life, or about the need to broaden one's horizons, or about a more playful, tender approach to life. It's a force that stands up for the best sides of human nature and gives them a platform and an authority in a noisy, distracted world. For too long, art's attracted a little too much reverence and mystique for its own good. In its presence, we're like someone meeting a very famous person. We get stiff and lose our spontaneity. We should relax around it as we already do with music and learn to use it for what it's really meant for, as a constant source of support and encouragement for our better selves.
It's the most.
What do you think about that? Hi, Aspen. I'm sorry I didn't. What's that, Brittany?
I was just saying I really enjoyed his thoughts on art.
Well, and I think it ties, I picked that because it ties beautifully into what we're talking about. You know, the idea that artists can function as prophets, or they can be hold up a self-reflective mirror. This ties directly in, believe it or not, to discussions on like Plato's The Cave, the allegory of the cave, and Confucian art, that the Confucius landscape painters created art that was designed specifically to remind people of the ideal, you know, of what we have to hope for, what there is to live for. And I really like that, because we can look at art. There is a lot of stuff that is miserable and depressing. That is for sure. That's one of the reasons why Francis Bacon was not a highlighted artist in this module, even though he was an expressionist. But looking at it through this kind of lens, we revisit Edvard Munch's The Scream, and we realize that it's not intended for us to be miserable. It's for us to grow empathy and compassion for other people who might be. And I think that's a beautiful thing to consider, which ties also directly into that Doctor Who clip from last week. But I think it's a great way to look at art, I believe.
I really liked when he was talking about how different art pieces might strike different people differently, or they are more uniquely, because of potential lacks of certain emotions that we don't have personally. I really liked when he showed Vincent van Gogh's Oranges. That's one of my favorite paintings. It has the beautiful oranges, and then it has the blue background. And that one is really powerful to me. I love those complementary colors. I love all sorts of things about that, the composition, the perspective. And I could see a lot of people taking a look at it and being like, oh, it's just a group of oranges. It's just a batch of oranges right there. But for me, for some reason, that signifies a lot of beauty to me because of the complementary.
I'm sorry, the sound is cutting out.
Oh, sorry. That I was just talking about Van Gogh's Oranges and how complementary and how calming they were to me.
Yeah, and I think that is a really beautiful example. And I'm thinking of things like his painting of daisies, or sunflowers rather. One thing that I really love about that is just as an exercise, I started looking at it and started thinking about how he made it. And what was astonishing to me is that I quickly moved from, oh my crap, this is going to take forever, to I began imagining the energy that he was putting in to how much he was paying attention to these flowers that he was painting. And that process started opening myself to appreciating the time it took, how much he liked it. You know, that expenditure of time was indicative of how much beauty he saw in it. That helped me to relate to that a bit. And then I started really paying attention to what was going on, and it became an intensely emotional experience, which is ridiculous because it's just a painting of sunflowers. I mean, who cares? But I think a big difference is you do that with a painting, you engage with it, you hold this conversation in your head with the ghost of the artist almost. You know, you engage with all these thoughts, and that's a completely different level of cognitive engagement than we ever have looking at somebody walking on a red carpet at one of the most celebrated variety shows of the year. And I think it's astounding to me, and I think it does point to what's important. Yeah, Brittany.
I was just thinking along the same lines, of when you stop and really think about a picture. There's on the LA art trip, there's a picture called The Ransom. And at first glance, like, it's not my type of art, but I fell in love with it for the same reasons why, like when you were stopping and thinking about the sunflowers, because I stopped and really looked at the picture and put myself into it and thought, okay, well, why did the artist do this? And saw the little tiny details, and then it opened up a new world.
Yeah, I think it's pretty amazing that happens. I wanted to share this is another video, and I'm thinking we'll just talk about it rather than watching it together. Let's see. And I'll just have you guys watch it on your own. But this is an excellent video, just describing how to look at art and begin to understand it. And it's done in a very similar vein to the one that we just watched. It's not the same thing, but it's similar. This is a famous painting by Magritte called "This Is Not a Pipe." And it seems when it came out, a lot of people were disgusted because it looked like an advertising sign. He just painted a pipe and wrote underneath it. That's it. A big deal. But what is interesting is that this is the birth of art that is really aware of itself as a cognitive tool for self-reflection. I think this is the birth of what 60 years later became I completely forgot the word for it. The word will come back to me later. But let's see if I'm sorry. Now it's going to bother me. Okay. I'm sure that nobody ever has this kind of thing going on with themselves. Let's see.
It happens to me on the daily.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the word I'm looking for is conceptual art. This is the birth of conceptual art, where the artist is sculpting instead of clay or wood, they're sculpting with the actual thoughts of the person who views it, where it's art aware of its own self-reflective nature, or the power that it has to cause you to self-reflect, and taking that and using it as a tool for communication. So yeah, I'm sorry about that for that cognitive dissonance there. I just total brain blank. But we've talked a little bit about where the meaning resides in art, and I think one of the things we talked about is it doesn't fully rest with the viewer, and it can't fully rest with the artist. It exists somewhere in between, and that's why I think of looking at art as a conversation, and specifically a conversation not just with the work, but with the ghost that we generate of whoever made the work, which I think is really interesting. At this time period, I wanted to say that the 19th century held an unprecedented amount of change for the world at large. Many different technologies were introduced. For example, newfangled photography, and Joey and I talked about that last week. Well, we all talked about it last week. But there was a certain amount of romanticization of warfare that with Matthew Brady and the other photos of specifically the Civil War and a little bit earlier of the Crimean War, that documentation pretty much put a nail in the coffin of the idea of romantic warfare. And photography also impacted portraiture, and it impacted perception as well, in sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. But that's just one technology, and you can imagine how many technologies people had to deal with. You know, you'd wake up one morning and there'd be new stuff that you had no idea was even possible the day before. And a really good example of this is, have you guys ever heard of Talbot's Pencil of Nature? That book that he wrote? He was an experimental photographer, and beginning in 1862, he began publishing a series of articles to be bound together in a book where he was talking about what photography could do. And in these chapters that he published, he was talking about documentation photography used in journalism. He was talking about even using photography for medical purposes. Like, you know, he was talking about X-rays before it even happened. And he was talking about using photographic film to track particles, or suggesting that could be potentially possible. So he was talking about all that stuff a generation before anybody actually started doing it. Super brilliant. And, you know, we look at it like I said, that is just one example of a technology that was being invented. And there are so many others. It's just really, really amazing. But my observation in this little section is, it talks about, and we already talked about what art means, but Impressionism, up until Impressionism, artists had their own styles. They had a lot of different things that they would do, but there was always this underlying current that the most important thing was the shared visual language with their audience or within their culture. Artists could do fascinating, interesting things with texture and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, they still had to produce something that other people could actually understand. And we don't normally think of that as a limitation, but it is interesting to me that Impressionism is like the first time that artists really started exploring in a visual way their own vocabulary, sometimes at odds with what people were expecting visually. Now, intellectually, that was already going on with Romanticism and Realism earlier, where people were making portraits and images of things that nobody really cared about, according to the art environment at large, where realism is dealing with people waiting for a barge or looking at a field, or in Romanticism is talking about or addressing ideas of the power of nature. And when it came to the US, it morphed into Hudson River Valley School, which did some really amazing, beautiful stuff. But in Impressionism, you're actually starting to get stuff that visually it was difficult for some people to relate to. Now, this the collector article that I reference, I think is a pretty good one. it shares 13 paintings, but just as everybody was pointing out, I'm sorry, I don't remember the names of who were pointing it out. A big thing that we see with Fauvism that's consistent to the Fauvism was this really odd use of color. And it's a color that is unexpected and inappropriate if you are trying to relate things that are specifically meant to be viewed as realistic. You know, and we can look at like this portrait, woman with a hat. Unless there is a wall next to the person that a light source is bouncing off, most people's faces are not going to be this color. And if they are, they need to go to the hospital immediately. But this kind of creative use of color allowed these artists to express ideas that they had inside of themselves in a visual language that they were creating for themselves to use. This was not a visual language that everybody participated in. And Fauvism did not last very long, but what the impact of it is, I believe, people, artists did Impressionism to start pushing the envelope of a shared visual vocabulary. Fauvism kind of showed them the end of what people could handle. And then that kind of gave them bookends within which to work, and they could start dealing with that range of visual vocabulary that pushed the boundaries of what was culturally acceptable, and allowed them to show how much audiences may or viewers might be able to stomach the things that they wanted to explore. You know, so one is Impressionism kind of pushes a little bit. Fauvism shows how far they can push it, and then, you know, condensing it together, they find an acceptable realm within which they can work. And I think that there's a couple things that are going on, but this opens the door later for abstraction. I say abstraction and its starry-eyed cousin, non-objectivism, because both of those are very related. Artists do have a tendency to explore the possibilities of acceptable visual language. And when they start pushing that, so it becomes so self-referential, so self-identifiable that they've, in essence, created their own visual language, it becomes very painful, very difficult, sometimes incredibly impossible for an audience to find any sort of shared point of reference to open the door. Like with Van Gogh, he's using he's exploring and experimenting with color use. But if you see a painting like oranges, you can accept that because you can recognize there's oranges, and that gives you a doorway to kind of start approaching the painting and begin a process of appreciation. Same thing with the sunflowers. You know, you can recognize that as a flower. But then when you start moving forward, you get to somebody like Jackson Pollock, you know, 70 years later, there's no frame of reference for somebody to enjoy that. It looks like a spatter, and that's all it is. And then if you take the responsibility as a viewer to start exploring and trying to gauge his visual vocabulary, then it starts giving you a doorway with which to begin to either respect or appreciate the painting, the image. And I wanted to share this video with you that is, I don't think, we're not going to have time to watch it, perhaps. But this video talks about finding the meaning in abstraction. And I really like this. This is from the Smart History. I love what they do. They have a cadre of art historians that are able to use small words when they talk about art so the rest of us can understand what they're saying, which I really, really appreciate. But in this, what they're talking about is when you come to a painting that is so foreign that you cannot find any shared visual vocabulary, then you find something in it that you do relate to. And in the example that they use is finding a color that you can latch onto. And then using that color, tracing that color throughout, trying to see where that color fits, where it departs from what's going on, where it does things that you expect, where it does things that are different, the energy, the flowing of the color, then that starts developing into an avenue where you can begin to respect what's going on. And then after a while, you might even begin to appreciate it and then actually enjoy the whole piece. And I love that perspective, finding something that you can latch onto. Well, when we talked about Fauvism, I wasn't kidding. When there are reports of some of the early shows of Fauvist art, there were women that actually fainted and others that threw up because it was so foreign to everybody's visual vocabulary. It was way too new for them. And the Fauvist painters did specifically try or work with communicating through their use of color. And you can see, I think, how this grows out of Impressionism, but because so many people rejected, the audience was not ready for Fauvism. I think that's why artists pulled back and kind of instead looked at the ideas that were progressing with Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and I see Expressionism as kind of a natural or an acceptable next chapter that came from Impressionism and then Post-Impressionism. That's just, it could be anything. But I use this little story of, the first time you meet somebody, you're not going to share with them the things that are so personal and incredibly self-referential. You're going to instead try to feel them out and see what kinds of topics they might be interested in or they might find acceptable before you start going into the really weird stuff. And I do talk about Bigfoot. I love, because I'm a folklorist, I love sharing folklore stories. I love seeing how folklore reflects kind of the numinous reality of a culture, the part of the culture that kind of helps people find their place in the universe, but nobody can really articulate very well. And Bigfoot is always a really good point of reference on that, because you can find every culture on the planet has their own version of Bigfoot, and it's really reflective of their own values. Which, like, for example, in Java, Indonesia, it's the orang pendek, which is a Sasquatch that's 4 foot tall. And but when I've learned that I can't start a conversation with that, I'll start talking to somebody and then kind of move it towards campfire stories and find out, the kind of stuff that they like. And if all they can talk about is coolers full of beer and gutting a deer, then I'll move on to different topics. And I feel that this transition time from the visual realism of the early 19th century to Fauvism of the early 20th century is kind of the same kind of way that artists were feeling out their potential audience. You also have to train your audience too. Yeah, and I think artists, because we have to make our living selling stuff, you have to find your audience, but I think you also have to teach your audience what's going to be okay for them. What permissions can they give themselves to enjoy and appreciate what you're doing? That's where my head is at, anyway. What do you guys think about that?
I'm still stuck on the 4 foot Bigfoot.
The orang pendek. I saw an interview with the on-site or the in-country National Geographic representative. His whole job is tracking tiger sightings. Wow. He said that they know there are tigers there. They're documented. But there is more physical evidence and more visual evidence of the existence of this 4 foot tall Bigfoot in Indonesia than there is of the Bengal tiger, which they know is there. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it. That just blows me away. But I use that as a reference point for art, because I think, if the first time I meet somebody and talk, say, hey, there's a 4-foot tall Bigfoot in Indonesia, I mean, they're going to shut the door. But if you're working with people and you talk about folklore and you kind of lead into it and say, yeah, and different countries have their own versions of different stories, and it's something we can all relate to, and we can build on that. Then after a while, you can talk about, okay, there's a Yeti, and there's actually a national park in Southeast Asia where the Yeti is the preserved species, and nobody can hunt the Yeti there. It's illegal. And then we talk about that, and there's the Yowie in Australia that can take trees and tear them in half. So, and do you know there's even a Yeti in Indonesia? Then we can move into it, and I feel that's how artists kind of do their stuff. They kind of feel their audience out. They kind of that's what's so fun in these exhibits in the North Commons building is there's stuff that is going to be really easily accessible to a lot of viewers, but there's also going to be stuff that's going to challenge people. And as you move through the exhibit, those barriers against the challenging stuff start to dissipate, so that by the time you get to the challenging stuff, you're already in the right headspace to find points that you can actually connect with it. And I just think that goes a long way, I think, in explaining, at least to me, the cognitive development of a lot of these movements that happen one after another. Without those changes in the cultural landscape, without understanding that artists are part of the area that they live in, and they're responding in a way different than people around them, so that more people have access to that kind of intellectual process. I think as we appreciate and understand that, then it seems to make a lot more sense how the art, the ways of visual expression kind of move forward. I think that's, anyway. You guys buy that? Does that sound plausible?
I loved that the interpretation of what you were saying about some of the artwork that potentially could be striking to some, and I love the idea that the collaboration in between cultures and how to inspire the opportunity to see different or unique perspectives from different cultures and how they can all coordinate together. I thought that was, I think it's really interesting.
And it's one of the things that's fascinating to me is as about 25 years ago, I started exploring this idea of cross-cultural pollination and interconnection. I was raised with Navajo and Shoshone siblings, and so I've always been in this kind of weird space where I am part of Caucasian culture, but I also know that that's not all that there is, and I'm not part of indigenous culture, but yet in some weird way I am, because these stories are my stories that I grew up with. My Shoshone sister, she was the one who raised me when my mom wasn't around, and so I learned about the Shoshone version of Bigfoot from her, and that's put me in a place where I can find these connections between different cultures. And it's fascinating to me, if you put somebody in a room with somebody who's very different from them and just expect them to start talking to each other, it's going to be very difficult. But if two people that are very different want to talk to each other, they will find something that they can both connect with. Another good example of that is the movie Waterboy, where one of the players tries to talk to Adam Sandler's character, and he knows that Adam Sandler is really, really, really feeling awkward, and Adam Sandler says, "My mama says this," and the guy says, "You know what? My mama says the same thing. Aren't mamas all the same?" And, I wish I had that clip. If I can find that, I'll put that to the module too. But I love that, and I think that gives kind of a point of reference. We're talking about expressionist artists from several different countries around the world, dealing with issues that were very present to them at that time, speaking about these issues or addressing these issues in very different vocabularies, because they were all very different people, but they're all doing the same kind of thing. And I think, aren't mamas all the same is a pretty good way to relate that. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. Give me just a second here. All right, there we go. Now, Expressionism, shifting gears just a little bit, Expressionism relates to artists expressing themselves, which I think is kind of a useless distinction, because don't all artists express themselves? I mean, we talked before, artists don't ever paint or draw what they see. They always paint or draw what they think about what they're seeing. So even if you're doing something realistic so that everybody else can engage with it, you're still expressing yourself. But I think what's different is that after Fauvism and Impressionism, artists are giving themselves or are claiming the permission to actually explore things using a visual language of self-expression that doesn't necessarily have to relate very closely to that kind of shared visual language. Now, each of these videos that I have here kind of are, well, almost all of the videos are pretty much sharing different paintings that the artists have done. And even though all of these, I think all of these artists painted several different movements. They have paintings that belong to several different movements. All of them fit squarely as well into the Expressionism. And I think it's fascinating having this selection because they do things that are very, very different from each other. And some of these paintings you can see came from earlier stuff that Vincent van Gogh did that were quite a bit more accessible for many people. And some of them came from a much later place. And so I recommend going through and looking at each of these videos that just kind of share what the artists were doing. And this is probably the most famous of the Expressionist painters, an image made by Edvard Munch. This is what everybody always gravitates to, this one right here, about Expressionism. This shows that the freedom of use of color and stroke or mark making that came about after 20, 30 years of Impressionism and then Fauvism. But it also demonstrates Edvard Munch sharing through his own expressive vocabulary how he felt about the world, or how he thought other people were feeling about the world. It is a very expressive painting. But he did other stuff too. And a lot of these things were a lot more gentle. They weren't as emotionally confrontational. And it is, on one hand, it is good to have like a poster child for an art movement. But I think if that's the only thing that we see, it kind of distracts from everything else that the artist could be doing. What do you think about this image? If I didn't tell you it was Edvard Munch, there is this face down below that might clue you into that. But as our eyes move up and we see the home and things like this, this doesn't feel as emotionally destructive or as painful as the scream does, which I think is really interesting. And that's why I encourage everybody to look. When you see a similar facial structure, this guy right here always reminds me of Frankenweenie from Tim Burton, his animated movie. Edvard Munch is exploring the ways that people have of expressing themselves, and he's showing emotion through exaggerated features. Simplification, exaggeration, distortion, all those are elements of abstraction. So he is using abstraction as a tool, but without consciously referencing it as abstraction. He's still exploring mark making and distortion as part of personal expression. And I love this painting because you can't get much farther away than the pain of the screen, I think. And this is by the same painter, the same artist. Isn't that amazing? The same guy did both things. Now, this is one of my favorite. This is the guy that I mentioned who said that artists were or functioned as prophets of a culture, of a society. And I want to, this is only a minute and a half long. This is how Wassily Kandinsky constructed his paintings. Now, he was a painter who was an expressionist. He's also considered one of the godfathers of non-objective abstraction. And this is how he developed his images. You know, he would work on them as musical compositions. And what was fascinating about him is he had synesthesia. So when he would hear sounds, he would also see colors. When he would see colors, he would also taste things. And I don't know if that goes. People have said, well, that explains his paintings. I don't know how it explains his paintings, but I do think it gives us a little bit more depth to explore as we look at his work, and maybe kind of give ourselves permission to hold off on judgment a bit until we appreciate what he does more. So let's watch this for just a minute. What do you see him doing as he's constructing that painting? What I think is pretty astonishing to me is that you can almost feel how he is relating to the lines and the marks that he's making, how he seems to feel things out. He knows where to start. He knows where to initiate contact with the paper, but it feels like he's kind of developing the thoughts behind the image as he's painting it. I think it's really kind of a fun thing to watch when an artist does that. And that is just a black and white film. Yes, Van.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I agree. I think it felt like he was filling out the lines as he was going. And he kept coming back to certain marks that he had made previously. He went over them multiple times.
Well, and I think it's really kind of fun to see that because it opens up a door into his thought process too. And I wanted to, let's see. In color, this is what his paintings look like. Now, there's not a lot of there's very few areas that we can really engage this painting at because there are no real visual references that we share. But as we look at it, maybe there's other things that we can connect with and find commonality with, like the colors. Like I'm thinking on this painting here, we have this beautiful blue right here. And I see that, and then I start thinking about how that relates to this darker field around it. And this kind of makes me think of a lamppost right there. And then that gives me at least a point of engagement where I can start looking at this painting, and which I think is a fascinating process, you know, just being able to start doing that. And I'm trying to get back to where I was before, and it's giving me a hard time. I love how wonderful and amazing computers are, but if I don't know exactly what I'm doing, sometimes it gets a little frustrating. So I do get really excited about Wassily Kandinsky's work, just because if you give yourself permission to start engaging with it, it opens up doors that you had no idea even existed. Okay, Brittany.
So when I was looking at Kandinsky's things, like I visualize, you know how you find images in clouds as a kid?
Right.
I do the same thing with his art. Like, what does that look like? You know, could it be this, or trying to imagine different connections in there besides just like the color, but maybe trying to visualize something like you would when you're a kid in clouds.
Yeah, and I think that is a perfect way to approach it. I think that's ideal, because when we do that, we open a door to start. You know, we give ourselves permission to start exploring it, and then that kind of vista expands more and more, and we can become more engaged with it. Whether or not our interpretation is what the artist truly intended, I think means so much less than the fact that we're having a conversation with the work and the ghost of the artist. Van?
Yep.
I just saw the hand up, so I thought that
Oh, I'm
meant
so
you had.
sorry. It must have
That's no
clicked
problem.
on there again. Sorry about that. Let me see if I can unclick it. There we go.
Okay. Now, the Bauhaus was a design school that developed in Europe to try to bring clarity to art and design, to establish a shared cognitive vocabulary so artists could communicate better visually and express themselves more fully. And Paul Klee, I absolutely, he's one of my very, very favorites. I absolutely love his stuff because he is able to do these rigorously intellectual exercises visually, addressing so many different kinds of schools of thought. He expresses himself in this vocabulary that I just find gorgeous. It's not confrontational at all. But we do find, like what Brittany was saying, we do find lots of these points of references so we can begin to engage with his work. Now, he is another one of these artists who sits squarely in several different movements. And some of his work, this is one of my favorite ones, you recognize that from the course. Some of his work sits very solidly in surrealism. Some of it sits very solidly in cubism. Some of it is very solidly in abstraction. And much of it also sits solidly in that expressionist kind of vocabulary that was being developed. He comes a little bit later than a lot of others, but I really find a lot of beautiful points of reference and contact with his work. Like, for example, this one, even though there's all these colors there, when I go up to like Dixie Rock, this helps me think about that. Some of these passages of texture and some of these areas where the rocks around St. George almost feel like they're manufactured. And that's the kind of thing that I think of when I look at Paul Klee's stuff. Helena Scherfbuck does some really amazing work. And she does a lot of stuff that I think connects her very squarely, like this one with Edvard Munch, but she also explores in her own direction as well. And it's exciting to me to see you know, here's a girl person who's engaging with expressionism. Some of her stuff is really disturbing. Some of it is really engaging. Some of it is really emotional, and some of it is very calming. And I love the breadth of expression that she has. I just think there's a lot of really beautiful stuff. And this guy yaks about it quite a bit. I haven't ever watched this with the sound on, just because I love these images. I think that this is particularly delicate and beautiful, and it reminds me of my daughters. You know, it's so I think these kinds of things are fun to be able to find within these bodies of work that these artists are making. A lot of the German expressionists, a disproportionate number of them, actually ended up committing serious self-harm. I have to do some self-editing so that YouTube doesn't block this, you watching this. There's another artist that I wanted to share with you that I think I will. He was also an expressionist, an abstract expressionist. So we'll probably look at him when we get closer to Jackson Pollock, and his work, even though it comes from this the same area where all these people were really exploring dark and depressing themes. Johannes Schreider is an artist that did absolutely profoundly inspiring and transporting work. So I didn't show it with these because these guys are, the German expressionists were not all an entirely happy bunch. But seeing where these artists from different countries and stuff like that, and seeing what engaged these countries together over the next 10, 15 years, I can really begin to appreciate why so much of the imagery does feel dark and depressing. Because whether or not the artists themselves dealt with that, that was part of the environment that they were swimming, part of the water that they were swimming within. Egon Schiele did an awful lot of expressionist paintings of human form, and his depictions deal with or develop a visual vocabulary that I think is absolutely fascinating, and I find that we still reference quite a bit even today. So he had an awful lot of impact. From the stuff that we're looking at, is anybody seeing any sort of points of connection among these different artists, the work that we're seeing? Some of the stuff that I see with these different artworks that we're looking at, I'm seeing a color use that is a little bit disconcerting, but it's not as jarring as what we saw with Fauvism. I'm seeing use of stroke mark making that feels a lot more, how can I say it? It feels like there's a lot more restrained expression than there was during the post-impressionism. Because there is a lot of energy there, but the energy feels like it's directed, and it's specifically directed. I see an abstraction of the human form in many cases that feels to be more of a relation of gesture and emotion overlaid on the human form than just an undirected distortion. For example, with Egon Schiele, the stuff that he was doing, you have really heightened cheekbones, you have jaw lines, you have breast forms and elbows and fingers that are really pokey, not necessarily designed to be to make you feel really uncomfortable and push you out of the frame, but more almost like the artist is exploring the gesture of the form and kind of relating that as it points to potential emotion. And so a figure is drawn with angles because he wants you to feel, the artist wants you to feel uncomfortable, or the figure is drawn with smooth lines because the artist wants you to let down your barriers, or the figure is drawn with large eyes like Edvard Munch because he wants you to engage with empathy. So the artists are using these kinds of marks to draw you into their own personal headspace. That's the kind of thing that I'm seeing. What are you guys seeing that connects these? Is there any, what kinds of things do you feel are connecting these artists?
I see in many of those an over accentuation of the human forms, especially facial features. When there are portraits, it shows, and when we're looking at representational paintings or sculptures, there's very subtle nuances, but these are pretty extreme when it comes to the capacity of really expressing emotion or having a heavy focus on the eyes or the mouth or the hands or things like that.
Does it feel, that's an excellent observation, does it feel to you as if they are intentionally being confrontational, or are they trying to get you to notice something? Inviting engagement as opposed to pushing you away, for example?
Yeah, I would think maybe both. In some of the paintings, I think that a lot of the accentuated features are trying to draw you in and focus on that specific aspect, but also can be also creating some confrontational measures of seeing things in a way that makes people uncomfortable as well.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating dichotomy. And it's astounding to me because it's not just, doesn't happen just once, it's consistent. And each of the artists have their own way of doing it, but it is consistent throughout this expressionist phase of their work. And I think that that's absolutely amazing. It's astonishing to me that people can be so comfortable with expressing opposites at the same time. It reminds me of the white Alice's conversation with the White King and Queen in Through the Looking Glass, when the White Queen tells her, "Why, darling, I always think of two contrary things before breakfast every day." And I think, how do you become so comfortable with holding these things in your head at the same time? And then I realized a lot of people at that time had to do that quite a bit. You want this to live in this calm and pastoral setting all the time, yet you still have to deal with confrontation on a daily basis. A lot of these communities that the artists are from are in areas where they feel that gray cloud of war coming close to them, but they also see, on one hand, there's so many people that are still using outhouses, and on the other hand, every day people are confronting the automobile. You have all these weird things that feel at odds with each other all the time. And I wonder if in some way the artists are kind of exploring that. I don't know. I think it's really fascinating. Are there any other points of commonality that you can see among these expressionist artists that we looked at briefly? Aspen, can you find any? I think, were you the one that talked about the Fauvist observations last time? Those were really excellent.
Yeah. No, he's not. Sorry, one sec. Well, I just thought it was, a lot of them were very, very different, because the Scream face had, a lot of the bold strokes, kind of like post-impressionism. But then the ones we just recently looked at, like, a lot of them didn't even have backgrounds. It was more just lines and, simple but exaggerated drawings of figures and things. But I think there's still that aspect of, like, all of them had something that was exaggerated to some extent, whether it was the color scheme or the sense of movement or the proportions. And I think they probably choose, like, I think the exaggeration is intentional. You know, what if it's with the colors? You know, colors affect the mood, and so if they're expressing an emotion, then it changes that. And then you were talking about the line quality. You know, the jagged lines would say something different than something with a lot of swooping motion. So I guess just even though they all look different, the way that they're communicating is all similar, is what I noticed.
Well, and I think that these observations are excellent because, like Van was pointing out, it's more exaggerated. It's less subtle, and you know, you're talking about how it's overt and it's intentional. And I think that I think that are really good. Those are really good descriptions. And I think one of the most important things that Expressionism gave to like future generations of artists or future movements is they were really demonstrating how an artist could lay claim on the right to express themselves, you know, with intentional exaggeration, intentional color use, intentional intentional direction of your gaze and things like this. And in later movements, a lot of artists either took that and ran with it, like the Cubists, or a lot of artists use that as a way to see how subtle, how they could parse it back and kind of explore it in a more subtle way. And I think Edward Hopper is an excellent example of that, you know, coming a little bit later, where he deals with some of these same kind of issues, but he does it in such a way that if you're an average American expecting to see a realistic landscape or a realistic urban landscape, his stuff is acceptable, but he's still dealing with those same kind of raw emotions that the Expressionists were shouting. And I think that that's really fascinating. But next week, we are going to be looking at something different. See if I can get back to it. Hold on just a second here. I love working with the internet because there are opportunities where I grow to depend on what the internet can do, and then all of a sudden everything shuts down when I'm in mid-thought, and I think that is excellent. It keeps you on your toes. Next week we're going to be talking about Cubism, and I think this is excellent because these movements that we've been looking at are preparing the way for people to more fully express themselves, and I think they're also training audiences to expect or to embrace the idea that artists are going to do weird stuff. And you know, I don't know if you guys have the same kind of families that I do, where they kind of dismiss my weirdness by saying, "Oh yeah, he's an artist." And I think that kind of expected weirdness is an outgrowth of an audience maturing and expecting that artists are going to do stuff that potentially challenges you. And I think that that's one of the doorways that was opened by these movements we just looked at. So next week, we're going to be talking about Braque, Picasso, and Duchamp and the different things that they did to expand our awareness even more. And what's fascinating to me is none of these movements are ever really over. You will see in the histories, the outlines, the timelines that we see that they say, yeah, the nail in the coffin was, you know, January 7th of 1942 or whatever it was. But that's not really the case because these things still inform our visual landscape today. And we can see that with, like, for example, that immersive Van Gogh exhibit. People are dealing with cutting edge interactive digital art, but they're still referencing Van Gogh. Or even things as simple and ubiquitous as quilt material from like scrap apple. A lot of the designs are still being informed by Paul Klee and the other expressionists or Favis. I've even seen fabric that you can buy at the Walmart fabric counter that for like kids' pajamas that is heavily influenced by the Favis. And I think it's so it never really goes away. But I really love exploring how these things relate to each other and give us a real strong window into that idea that the artist is a self-reflection and prophet of the society within which they swim. I think that's really cool. Any questions or final observations before we move on to the next week? All righty then. Thank you very much for your patience today, and thank you very much for staying awake during the entire hour and a half. That really is a big boost to my ego. And I hope you guys have a safe and wonderful weekend. Nobody gets sick, nobody gets hurt, and I look forward to seeing you guys next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you go, I forgot. Let's. How are you guys doing on the projects?
Great.
Okay. Well, I'm going to link to the part of our YouTube channel for the classes here at Utah Tech that is some of the projects from other classes that people have done, just so you can see how they've done. There's only, excuse me, most people are not doing videos, so there's very few of them. But I'll link to that. And if you can't get it done on Sunday, that's not a big deal. I would, whatever questions you have, anything like that, contact me, talk to me, and I will help you sort things out. And if you're around when I'm in my office, come by and talk to me about your project. I'm excited to see what people are doing. Now, Brittany, for another class, did an exceptional project. So if you guys find her in the hallway, grab her, waylay her, and ask her about hers because she did a terrific job. Before you do grab her, make sure you have a treat with you so she doesn't see you as a threat. Yes, Brittany.
I'm all about the treat. Did you see my one for this class? Yeah.
No, I haven't yet. Your prehistory one was exceptional. That's the one that I'm referring to. So did you post the one that you did for this class on the discussion board?
I can't remember if I did or not, but I know I sent it to you.
Okay. As soon as you can, post it on the discussion board if you haven't already. And everybody else, go to the discussion board and see what she's doing. Brittany has a really good handle on the kinds of things that we're doing as projects for these classes. So that's really good. Sorry to put the spotlight on you, Brittany, without asking your permission first, but there it is. You still got it.
I'm not sure if this one meets the standard of the other class, though.
Okay, well, I'll reserve judgment on it then, but only because you told me to. I think the most important thing about due dates is getting the assignments that are due before midterms done before midterms so that you know where you stand at midterms. That's the most important thing. And as I see projects come in, if you don't get a perfect score, look at my comments and also talk to me if you're confused at all. After class today, I had several students stop and talk to me about their projects, and it was really fun because everybody had great ideas. We just needed to tweak it a little bit so that it would keep down to the time requirement. So instead of being a 20-hour project, it would only be 3 or 4, and also to direct it so it related to, specifically to the class that they were in for the project. So, and we talked about everything from, one guy is going to be doing a feast of different foods that he saw in a painting of the Renaissance. Somebody else is going to be manufacturing their own paper and then doing cave drawings on the paper so it looks like it's on an actual rock surface. Somebody else is actually developing tumbling routines from images that they saw in depictions of tumbling in Kabuki era prints from Japan. So there's lots of really interesting stuff that people are exploring. So again, if you have any questions, let me know. But I will look forward to seeing you guys on Wednesday if I don't see you sooner. And I hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.